Welcome to Blue Grit Radio, the podcast that explores making better cops for a better community. I'm your host, Eric Tung. I've been an active police officer since 2007. We will dive into the aspects of police culture, health and wellness, leadership, and mindset. You'll hear from experts not only from policing, but all industries as they relate to being our best with purpose, passion, and positivity. Join me as we share stories, lessons, and advice so we can all be better for ourselves, our teams, our families, and our communities. All right, ladies and gents, welcome back to another episode of Blue Grit Radio. This is your host, Eric, and today I'm joined by Dr. Gino. Doc, do you want to please introduce yourself?
Absolutely, brother. Well, first and foremost, man, thank you so much. A, for hosting me and having me, and B, just for doing what you do, man. I think what you do is so incredibly important. These conversations that matter so much to the heroes in our community and those that wear the shield and wear the badge, right? So I think it's pretty awesome, and I'm humbled and privileged. So I'm a behavioral scientist by trade, man. So basically what that means is I unpack what's going on in the brain by studying past patterns within human behavior, and then also understanding where we're at currently and kind of project, right? Like what is the next 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 years hold for us, right, as a species, right? How do we react and deal with stress, anxiety, depression, addiction, right? How do we respond within fight or flight, right? All those different components, man, that affect people, right, who are out there doing the work, rolling their sleeves up, right? I mean, historically, I've done a lot of work in the U.S. Special Operations space, but I have spent plenty of time with law enforcement officers as well.
Yeah, and before we start recording, you're talking about like the depth and maybe breadth of things that we could talk about. And I'll also just throw in, before we get too far, me and Dr. G connected on our friends at the Collective, Chance and Shaun, shout out, with so many, actually, like a good pantheon of fantastic guests that I've been able to introduce through Blue Grit. But just having that group conversation, I was like, dude, this guy's money. I mean, you're on the money. I think not just your profession and your scientific insight, but just how you conduct life, right? We get into family stuff on that conversation. It would probably go there too, talking about relational things. That's another one of your prime tenets and areas of expertise. So I do want to give a little bit of a teaser to the audience when they're like, oh shoot, like there's that other dimension too. But yeah, like before we start recording, you're talking about working with the combative mindset, counterinsurgency, or working with special ops. You want to expand on that a little bit and kind of the crossovers there, military, police, all that?
Yeah, no, absolutely, man. Right. So look, man, at the end of the day, right, as public servants, I mean, the key word there is you're a servant, right? You're there to serve the hearts and minds of others, right? To make whatever hardship they're going through, whether it's a critical emergency, right, or something as simple as a cat being stuck up in a tree, right? Like you're there to provide that cloak, that comfort of strength, of honor, of protection. But that also requires a lot more than just the physical side of it, right? There's a real connection with hearts and minds. And that kind of sounds familiar, right? To a lot of things that have been done overseas historically, right? With this entire concept of counterinsurgency operations, right? So winning hearts and minds, right, of a local population to pull them to kind of gravitate towards a loyalty factor, right, between an allied force and locals, to be able to build that camaraderie, that trust, that bridge to hopefully achieve fruitful outcomes in overthrowing an opposing force. A little different, right, in the law enforcement side, but the standing component is trust, right? The standing component is communication. The standing component is authentic connection with those that you are called to serve, right? And that's a really potent and powerful thing. And I think far too often, so many folks that go into the line of work, right, of being a public servant and being a first responder, there's so much to learn, man. There's so much to like regulate and modulate, because you're dealing with incredibly stressful situations 1 second, right? And then the next second, not so much, and everything in between. And it's no one day is the same, right? There's always There's always a mix of things that you're dealing with. And I think a lot of people don't realize kind of the toll that takes on the brain, right? And maybe in the very beginning, it's cool, right? But over time, right, there's a very real factor of it being a grind, right? And the emotional continuum that's involved, that has a very real effect on relationships at home, a very real effect on relationships with those that you call your friends, right? And your partners. Because at the end of the day, man, like, we're human beings, not human machines, right? So tending, right, and nurturing that garden within that allows us to continuously explore the frontier that's outside, is a really important thing. So the difference of just checking the boxes versus really embodying what it takes to optimize one's performance and behavior as a human being.
Yeah, there's a lot there, and I'm going to kind of rewind and try to unpack some of that. So, I mean, we understand, when we send troops overseas, um, more recent decades of military action. Hey, we can't just overthrow the dictator and not help support the community, right? Like, so we can't build democracies without helping show them the way, right? And this is a super like really bare explanation. And
Mm-hmm.
so then we look at policing, and we've had, in my own career, so I'll speak personally in case people mistake it for like me putting, pointing the finger, sounding judgmental, but we've had, these themes of law enforcement where it's not intended to become us them, but we do lean that way at times, especially when the pressure's high, especially when it's super violent and really traumatic.
Mm-hmm.
And then you get the scrutiny, right? So you're like, you don't even want me here, and you don't even want me to do the thing I'm trying to do to help you, like you meaning the community and society. And we
Mm-hmm.
saw a lot of that in the last few years. And I think that the takeaway is, whether you call it or you label it, community policing or public engagement or these things, we realize we can't just do our job without affecting and hearing and seeing and showing that we're hearing and seeing the people that we're building this community with, right? So it's not us, them. And I know that some people think that that's, just, this is just PR talk. It's not. Like, ultimately, our mission is to make safer streets, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you can't do that by just going in, with the sledgehammer, grabbing out the violent people, and then leaving without a trace.
Yeah. I think it's such an important part there too, Eric, right? Is like the us them side of it, right? I mean, this idea of, especially from a policing action perspective, like they are you and you are them. Like we're in the same backyard, right? We're
Mm-hmm.
not deployed overseas, right? Doing
Right.
something for a particular mission set, right? That's to establish a sovereign nation or democracy, whatever that is, right? This is your own backyard, right? So it's a very different vibe when, when you're out there on a beat, right? And knowing that your home is 9 miles away, right? And where your kids play and where you go to put your head down to rest. Like these are things that are affecting your community real time, which I will tell you, man, I spent about 3.5 years of my life in Latin America, specifically in Colombia, South America. And this is way before my academic endeavors, right? But I was in the anti-kidnapping space. And I had very close alliances with Colombian military police, right? And specifically a unit there called La Jungla, right? Which translates to the jungle, right? And basically they're, think American Green Berets, right? And kind of what they do with force multiplication and going into hot zones, right? And being able to
Mm-hmm.
burn down like coca fields and that's and win hearts and minds of the locals there as well. But that's what they do for the Colombian army, right? And military police. So long and the short, um, what they did is like half military, half law enforcement, right?
Mm-hmm.
But how they operated, man, was really impressive, right? And that's kind of one of the things that spawned me going into this field of study, because they're operating in their backyard every day, right? And then like 3 in the morning they're doing a raid, and by 5 o'clock in the afternoon they're taking their daughter to ballerina practice, right? And it's like
Yeah.
5-6 days a week, right? So
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 that's what's challenging. And sorry to interrupt, but
no,
we
please go ahead.
talk about policing in the community. Yes, we all are all domestic. Those of us
Mhm.
in law enforcement doing the domestic local side of law enforcement for sure, right? However, there is that dynamic, and because of the challenges, you do find most law enforcement officers want to live outside of their area, right?
Sure.
And it might be as simple as jurisdiction. It
Yeah.
might be like a 30, 40 hour long commute for some where they choose that. And so I don't think that there's a right or wrong. I think you got to find what's right for you. But
Yeah.
I'll say at the same time, although I chose my place of employment originally because I wanted the action, I wanted the development, the challenge of high
Hmm.
crime, high pace, like it's not where I grew up, but I could see a lot of aspects that resonated with, the kind of communities that I interacted with through my whole life. And then now I've been there nearly 2 decades. And so in so many ways, that is my community. Like I have a stock. Like as long as I've been a cop, I've been there. I've been a cop
Yeah.
there, right? So I know the needs, or I try to continue to assess the needs. So I only just illustrate that reflection point because I think without that, some people with less time on might kind of say, no, I purposely compartmentalize it. And yeah,
Hmm.
you can to some extent. It may help this area of how you process or how you, I guess, kind of keep these things separate, manage stress. But at the same time, it's going to have consequences in good and bad ways.
Yeah. Yeah. Let me ask you this, Eric, just, I mean, from my own curiosity, right? Like the compartmentalization side, is that something, especially with a career spanning 2 decades? I mean, is that what you have found to be most effective for you?
I'm right in the middle, and I know that that's like not sexy, but some folks are like, you can't compartmentalize. You gotta, address it all,
Right.
and
Right.
I think that's not right. And I think that
Hmm.
the reason, and it's probably a oversimplification,
Hmm.
because we can't just bottle everything up and like shove it all under the rug, right? That rug's going to be a giant mountain in the living room. However, there is an aspect where you have to compartmentalize in the moments to be
Hmm.
successful and effective. Um, Example is going to like a kid call. I know, especially being a dad now, like I knew that those calls affected me pre-dad, right? I just knew
Yeah.
that about me, and I'll have a stiff upper lip, and I'll get through the call. If I really let myself go and let me be me in the moment, I'm not going to be objective, right? I'm going to be there with the family and mourning, and that's not my job, right? Like it's one thing to show a healthy level of compassion, what feels right for you, where you lean, and then where you are in the moment. And it's not to say if you show emotion you failed. No, I'm just saying, like, for me, I recognize like, no, I got a job to do. I'll do it in a caring, professional way. And then when I go home, I'll probably have the emotional dump and
Yeah.
talk to my wife about it, because that
Yeah.
really sucks.
Yeah. Yeah. I asked because I couldn't agree with you more, right? The idea of I don't believe that there's a one size fits all, right? And I
Mm-hmm.
think unfortunately in Western medicine and Western psychology, there's a push for that, right?
Mm,
There's a push, right, for to have it fit a particular box, almost a cookie cutter approach to help on the
sure.
clinical side of it. And meaning making is different for everybody, right? I mean, the meaning making process, the embodiment process, right? Even the somatic process, right, of what's happening at that moment in time, it's going to shift from person to person. And to your point about maintaining the professionalism of it, right? And what is it that you need in that moment in time to do your job effectively, right? To provide the service, right, that the community is depending on you to provide. And I think that is such an important thing. But I also feel like it's an ambiguous one as well, because there's a lot of conflicting data, right, and a lot of
Mm-hmm.
quote unquote experts out there, right, when it comes to this. When in truth, the matter, I truly believe that, man, unless you have walked a mile in those shoes, it's really hard. It's really hard to understand that, man. I could sit here all day and read every peer-reviewed article and even conduct a study on it, but like, man, the humanistic element of it, like you really got to feel it, you got to taste it.
Yeah, yeah, and it's so hard. And one of the notes I made on the side was, kind of this notion of hypervigilance and these things that we contend with within in this job. And so that came front of mind when you're talking about all the things you're talking about in your intro. And
Yeah,
so then we talk about compartmentalization, like how do you bring work home with you, how it affects your relationships. I mean,
yeah,
shoot, it affects your relationships at work, and that's the folks you're doing it with all day long. And so it has to be super specific to the individual and the context and how that day went and how your career's been, because my police career is extremely different than just a host. I mean, literally everyone else that I've ever met or worked with
yeah.
specifically, but then even outside of my department is going to be very different, and then outside the state it's going to be very different. And so yeah, we can't cookie cutter it just like anything health or wellness, or just like kind of your own personal drives and directions. I think, for all that said, there is going to be the officer that's going to be very successful when they get down on a knee, and then they embrace someone that's down on the ground because
Hmm.
they had a moment of loss. And there's also going to be the officer that's just like, nope, I'm not doing that. Like I'm standing up here. I'm gonna try to say, hey, I'm really sorry. I'm gonna kind of wait for them to have their emotional moment, and I'm gonna go back to the information I need. I think that, when you get into the weeds of reflection and what you're trying to do, it's so hard unless you have those guardrails and know
Hmm.
what your main purpose is and what your objectives are on that type of incident or on that type of call. Otherwise, you're going to have yourself trying to empathize with the suspect you're trying to arrest and use force against. I mean, that's not appropriate.
Hmm.
You're going to cloud your mind with all these other things. And so, where am I going with this? Where I'm going with this is, like, in the example of a suspect, you make sure that your policies, practices, and procedures are aligned with the law, your values, morality. And so in the moment, you don't have to hyperfixate on these things. You think about what is being presented to you, the stimulus, the actions, and you will answer back with these types of contingencies. And
Hmm.
at the end of the day, when it's safe to do so, that's where you can show some empathy. That's where you can show some compassion, right? You can try that, when you have your your practices in place, you can try those compassionate negotiations. But ultimately, what you may have to do,
Mm-hmm.
because at the end of the day, what is your mission? Well, it's to make safer streets, right?
Right.
And we can't over prioritize or get too much in the weeds. And that's I suppose that's where I went with this denial of compartmentalization, because
Mm-hmm.
truly it would be that, right? I'd be like, oh, I don't want to hurt this person. Like they're just going through a terrible day.
Right.
Yes, they are. However, we still have all the things we have to consider.
So I think it's a really important thing too, man. Like this idea, and you said a key word there that kind of clicked the bell in my mind. It's alignment, right? So
Mm,
really having a very clear understanding of how important it is, man. So like a lot of us, we talk about, leave work at work and home is home, and there's a very clear divide right in the middle of it, right? And yes, to a point, right? Because at the end of the day, right, like the values that you carry, right, as dad, as husband, right, or as wife and as mom, right, and then the values that you carry on the job, right, like there should be, right, strong alignment, right, that's shared there, right. Now the way in which the values are expressed, given what it is that you have to do, right, different. Right? How you're going to
yeah.
deal with conflict at home and how you're going to deal with conflict, right, on a beat is two different things, right. But at the end of the day, the heart of it, right, and how it is that that's translating through your identity as a person, like that is the number one thing that I see the most amount of contention with, right. Like identity A fighting with identity B, and it's the same person. And there's this constant popping right between the two of them. And it's a very, very ambiguous place to be, man. And ambiguity is the number one thing that the brain despises, right? I mean, it does not like being confused, especially confused about who we are and what we're doing and why we're doing it. So I think it's, for law enforcement officers in general, I mean, it is such a, especially in today's environment where man, like the amount of stimuli that's out there, right? And the amount of political movement that exists. I mean, I'm
Hmm.
speaking here from the States, right? Like you have one side that is so supportive, right? Like, yes, we love our Leos. And you have another side where it's literally like, it's horrific. Like,
Hmm.
defund them. We don't need them. We don't want them, right? And so, but to be in the middle of that and be like, I just want to serve my community. I want to be
Hmm.
a good person. I want to be a good steward, right? And make sure that we all stay safe. Balancing that, man, like it seems easy, right? But from what I have found, it is not. It is not an easy thing to navigate for professionals, right? Who are within law enforcement.
Yeah, I love this notion of identity, and we've been attacking it a lot on the show and in my socials articles because of the over identity, in our
Mm,
first responder job,
mm,
because of the conflict of identity that you're talking about. At the time that this episode airs, it'll probably be out for a few weeks on Police One, but it was a part of the Ask Tongue column where someone's asking, "Hey, what would you have young officers focus on? Like, what's your advice and feedback from
mm.
your experience and your perspectives?" And there's so much stuff you got to learn as a young officer, a new officer, I should say. Uh, hard skills, soft skills,
Sure.
case law knowledge. But where my answer went and prompted actually through LinkedIn when I asked just a bunch of experienced law enforcement officers, like, "Hey, what would you say?" And almost everything, like overwhelming majority, was all about work-life balance or how you hack at that, how you
Hmm.
create these better boundaries and protect your identities and your volitions outside of work
Yeah.
for relational purposes. So the article explores some of that, and so I want to ask you,
Yeah.
with all that said, what are some things that you would recommend people to prevent that creep, right, of identity where everything's just about cop work or everything's just about
Yeah.
fighting fires?
So, man, we're about to go deep. Okay. So
Hmm.
two
Here we
things,
go.
right? That I always have folks that I work with within the special operations industry do, and it doesn't matter. Anyone who carries a warrior ethos, right, where there are embers of fight within, right, and doing what it takes in the name of what is righteous and what is good, right. First thing is this: you have to have it, and the power of the written word, right? Like there's a lot of salience to that, right? Literally, write down on a piece of paper your own personal constitution,
Mm,
right? So like if you think of the totality of who you are, right, as a human being. If I didn't know you at all, Eric, like we never met, right, and had no clue, and I read a piece of paper, right, that was your constitution, I should have a very clear understanding, right, of at least the boundaries. right? Like,
Yeah.
what is your up? What is your down? What is your left? What is your right? And at the end of the day, when the short dash, the vapor of your existence in the flesh is no longer here, right? And that piece of paper is what represented you, right? It can be embodied and understood and spoken about by those who loved you the most as an authentic piece of paper, right? Like this was him, right? And it's not a mission statement. It's not values. It's different, right? So I always encourage people, go look at the U.S., like just Google the U.S. Constitution, right? And everywhere where it says the United States of America, put your name in and adjust accordingly, right? That way
Mm.
you have an idea, a framework, right? But you're talking about one person, you yourself, you are a sovereign being, right? So elaborate, extrapolate that. That's number one. Number two, give yourself about a month from when you do that Constitution exercise, right? And this one gets a little spicy. Write your obituary.
Mm. Man, that's heavy.
It is, right?
For a
It
lot.
is.
For a lot.
Yeah, right? The point and purpose of doing that is here you have a living, breathing document that as each year goes by, you should revisit and put amendments to. And here you have what that document at the end of the day, the impact it was supposed to have, right? Do they align?
Mm.
Is there alignment between the two of them? And more importantly, do those that know you the best agree with what's on that piece of paper? Those who hold you accountable. Daddy, are you a good dad? Right? Husband, are you a good husband? Right? So on and so forth. Partner, are you a good partner? Right? Is there affirmation and validation from them? Because if you want to talk about being in alignment and being authentic and not having those clouds of gray pop up here and there, which happens to all of us, right? The whole point is to minimize their existence. Nothing gets more to the point, right, than being able to actually physically represent it and have a conversation piece to talk to people that you trust with all your heart about it.
Yeah, that's huge, man. And what I hear is who who am I? Who am I at this moment in
Mm-hmm.
this day? It's all built upon who I've been, right? So put that down. What
Mm-hmm.
makes me me? And then who do I intend to be, right? Like who do you intend to have, whether you have 20 days or 20 years left, or hopefully more, depending on your age.
Yeah.
Your obituary, like, are we way off, right? Because if I'm like going to interpret this, if my constitution is saying XYZ, and then my obituary is something that is so, it sounds so far fetched and lofty, then maybe I'm not even close, right? I need to adjust my constitution and then make sure that I'm abiding / living and resonating in, I suppose, representing that, right?
That's exactly right. I mean, here's the thing, man. Like so many of us, so like a fun fact, right, for the listeners. So the human brain, right, we will produce 12,000 to 60,000 thoughts a day, right? That's just I mean, that's a big gap, right? There's a lot, there's a lot of function in there, right? But
It's a lot of
12,000
different
to
types of
60,
people for sure.
that's exactly right,
But that's
right?
still a lot, right? 12,000.
It's a lot, right? 90% of those thoughts, right, are the same exact thoughts you had yesterday, right? We're creatures of habit, right? Even the way in which we produce mental models, right, neurologically. 80%, right, of those thoughts, right, are negative, right? Why? Because the brain is constantly wired to keep you safe, to keep you out of danger, and to be able to foresee potential surprises because we don't do surprises. We don't like them,
Mm-hmm.
right? Not talking about the fun type, right? I'm talking about the potentially scary stuff, things
Yeah.
that are threatening to our existence. And what a lot of people don't realize, man, is that, we live in a very modern age, but at the same time, our biology, our neurophysiology, right, is still stuck in what we were 5,000 years ago, right? The adaptation evolution process has not caught up to the rapid advancements of technology. So, for example, when you get behind someone and you light them up for a speeding ticket, right, like what they're dealing with right there, that stress response and their HPA axis going nuts, it's the same response they had when a saber-toothed tiger was trying to eat them, right, thousands of years ago. But in reality, you're just pulling them over for, a traffic violation or whatever
Mm-hmm.
the case may be, right? But in their mind, like, I'm in trouble, right? It's the
Yep.
same neurohormone dump, right, that was developed for over thousands of years, right? So we have not caught up to understanding of, oh man, this isn't going to be fun. I'm probably going to get a ticket, but I'm going to go about my day and everything's going to be fine. That's not there, right? That we have not filled that gap in yet. So how we deal with stress as a species, we're actually going backwards a little bit, right? And hence why you see so many crises with mental health, depression, anxiety, so on and so forth, because we're not taught the skills, we're not taught the tools to bridge the gap so we can maintain alignment to achieve optimal behavior, to achieve optimal outcomes.
Yeah. And even yeah, that danger piece, I want to laugh at myself because I feel and it'd be so cool and impossible to measure my stress response getting pulled over since being a cop, but I would wager that it's worse because there's these added things of like, oh, am I carrying? And I got to tell the cop I'm carrying, and then
Yeah,
he's going to think I'm just trying to get off with a ticket, or is he going to recognize me now? Right? Like,
yeah,
that's
yeah,
super embarrassing. That's super freaking
yeah,
embarrassing.
yeah,
Um,
yeah, yeah, yeah,
all these things, but yeah, man, I think that we forget, where we came from sometimes, right? We're
Mhm.
in the rigmarole, and then sometimes going along with those negative thoughts, I recognize at times that I let someone, whether it's at work or through the socials, like they get under my skin.
Oh
And I'm
yeah,
like, why?
yeah,
Why does it bother me so much? And then
hmm
I've even told some people, like, it really bothers me how much it bothers me. So I'm
yeah,
recognizing that I want to be, I want to have more stoicism, but
yeah,
regardless, right? I felt attacked, right? And I
yeah,
felt like that was a danger. And that's like primordial, right? Like it's that
yeah,
evolutionary biology where yeah, I know that there's no poisonous snakes around where I live, but if it's kind of dusk and I step outside and I think I see some movement, like I have
yeah.
that, you have that shoot in your chest where you're like,
Oh,
oh, like
oh, yeah,
you actually think in a moment, like you feel like something's gonna get you, and you're like,
yeah,
that doesn't make any sense. It was nothing.
yeah. No, that's exactly right. There's a great book out there, and for your listeners, I would highly recommend it. Right, it's called "Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers,"
Mm,
and it's by a
yeah, I've heard of this.
neuroscientist, okay, by Robert Sapolsky, right, and it dives into exactly what we're talking about, right, and it really unpacks what is happening and why it's happening, right, and what can we do about it. And I mean, the answer is so simple, but yet it's so difficult to achieve, right? Because like we're charged with keeping up with quote unquote social progress, right? And then the deeper philosophical question there is that actually progress, right? Given
Mm,
the current state of overall humanistic health, right? But more importantly, though, like when you understand this concept of self mastery, right? Like that's where the good stuff really starts to kick up. Man, like the very first step is achieving alignment, and like it takes time. Like it's not like people like, oh yeah, I'll do that exercise, I'll do the obituary thing, and then I'm good. And it's like you gotta let it marinate, man. Like you gotta give it like there are just some things that you can't replace the value of time, right? And
yeah,
time needs to do its thing, right? And so slowly but surely, right? There'll be increments of like a dash here and a dash there. And then, 6, 12, 18 months down the line, you're like, okay, I'm kind of starting to get this idea, right, of what it is, right, that they're talking about.
yeah. A couple things come to mind is that it's that continual pursuit, right? So it's not
Mm,
about the destination, but it's
right.
recognizing that the destination should be that grind, that daily work, and as you said, that mastery.
Yep.
And I think that that's exactly my point in going to the original prompt, right? Like, how do you navigate all these things? How do you maintain these better boundaries? And that's like making sure that you're continuing to refine and assess and seek feedback, right? Accountability, right? Even to the earlier point where our constitutions and our obituaries should be recognized and probably like get the stamp of approval from those closest to us. So it's
Mhm.
not just our inflated sense of self, our ego, like overtaking you know, this whole exercise.
Yeah.
And that alignment piece, like what sticks out to me is I think it might be one of those like nature's cruel jokes where, talking to somebody about losing a dog and putting your dog down. And it was something that we said in Canine a lot, which is that, by the time your dog is exactly what you want, a working dog, your relationship, the bond, his skills, his intuition, his drive, he's basically about to retire, right? He's old. He's a bag of bones. Um, I feel like the same way it's probably like to some extent like us, right? Like by the time if we're doing things right, like that's really being on like most of the time and being healthy and mindful, then we'll probably get to a pretty good space and place when we're, pretty far. We're pretty
Yeah.
advanced in life. And that's okay, but
Yeah.
I think it's one of those things where we can see the humor in that, but as long as we appreciate the journey, the day by day, like make that your pursuit, the actual
Mhm.
pursuit is your pursuit, then I think that we can get along.
I think a really important element to that too, man, is the quality of what it is that you're feeding yourself, right? And I'm not talking about like an actual food diet, right? I'm talking about
Yeah,
what it is that you're exposing.
but maybe that too.
I mean, that too, yeah, for sure, right? Obviously, there is correlation there, but the quality of what you listen to, the quality of what you watch, right? When you're not on duty, what are you doing, right? Like, what's the depth, right? So, like, a big thing that I harp on a lot with people is the quality and depth of relationship you have with yourself will always define the quality and depth of relationship you can have with other people. But if you're not continuously doing things to push your understanding, to garner new tools, right, to unpack new things about yourself, right, like, and really get full control of them, right, you're kind of flying blind, right? And so when you are having certain reactions or responses, even when you recognize them, beautiful that you recognize them, right? Like there's a lot to be said about the actualization side of things, right? But what are you doing to master that reaction, right? And that's where that self mastery component comes into place, right? It's the next step, just like neuroplasticity, right? Like a lot of people have talked about neuroplasticity and how important it is, right? I mean, especially in the line of being a law enforcement officer, right, or anyone who's in line of duty, right, and exposed to danger, right? Well, neuroplasticity is really, really good, right? But there's another step, right? That step is neuroagility, right? So
Mm,
like, how do you not just take what currently is and make it pliable to be a bit better? How do I go from this side of my brain to the other side of the brain, right? Like that with ease, right? And not feel any sort of conflict, right? Or an internal static about doing it, right? And that takes another level of confidence and understanding, right, of what's happening emotionally, what's happening psychologically, and even to a point of spiritually, right? And not to get into the realm of religion, right? But just however you want to define spirituality, right? But like, there's an intrinsic worth to every human being, right? That's what makes us a very special and unique species, right? However you unpack that and define that, what's your understanding of it? Because that absolutely plays a role.
yeah, that's huge, and I think that is a healthy thing to bring up, right? Spirituality, the sense of greater meaning, the sense of purpose, and
Mm-hmm.
I'll even submit, the more I chew on it, and this is coming from me identifying as all kinds of I guess assignments, from
Yeah,
agnostic to Christian, and
yeah.
uh, I I tend to find, or I believe, that spirituality is not closely correlated with religious belief, right? And
Mm-hmm.
so,
Mm-hmm.
and I think that the reason why I offer that is I think a lot of people that aren't sure where to put their flag, right?
Mm-hmm.
I'm trying to suggest that that's okay, and also recognize, like,
Mm-hmm.
for myself, I would look at very highly devout religious folks and be like, well, that's not the answer because they treat people
Mm-hmm.
like garbage. Or
Right.
conversely, I hear these things of spirituality. I'm like, well, that's kind of weird and woo, and I don't think that's the thing. I think it's
Right.
just more broadly, like, yeah, that sense of purpose. Like, you got to believe in something,
Yeah.
and that's one of my mentors kind of threw that at me, not antagonistically or anything. We're having one of these awesome deep dive discussions. He's like, "Do you believe in good and evil?" And I'm like, "Of course." He's like, "Well, what is that built upon? Like, what makes something good or evil?"
Mm-hmm.
And then I just really sat with that probably for weeks, and I was like, "What does make that? Like, if not something, right?"
Yeah. Yeah. No, and I think there's a lot. I mean, man, whew, on the religious side of things, I think it's really important, right? And just as an example, right, to kind of piggyback on your point about the hyper quote unquote religious people, strongly affiliated with one institution or another. I mean, like, I'll take Christianity for example, right? When you look at the history, and I mean, I self-identifying as a Christian, right? But when you look at the history of the faith, and you understand that the the Pharisees and Sadducees, right, were this old group of very, very, hardcore religious people. They're the
Hmm.
ones who sent Jesus Christ to be crucified, right? Like
Hmm.
Pontius Pilate made the call, right? But that influence came from people within the Jewish church, like that was their role, right? So like this idea of just because they're associated or affiliated, right, in one religious institution or another does not mean that everything they say is right or they're setting the right example, right? A spiritual relationship, however you want to define that, what that connection is a vastly different thing than having claims and ties, right, to one religious institution or another. Right.
Yeah.
I mean, and I offer that as my own 2 cents, my own opinion, right? Of course,
Yeah.
right. But um,
Absolutely.
I'm in agreement with you on that, right? And I think that's a really important thing because there is this overlap where people think that, oh no, that means I have to start, going to temple or going to mosque or church or whatever the case is, right? And it's not. My opinion is that is actually something that starts from within, right? Go for a walk in nature, right, and do some breathing techniques, right, and just kind of explore what you start to feel, right? I mean,
Yeah.
that could be a potential avenue.
And I'm glad we talked about that because ultimately, whether I'm coaching somebody or, the article where I'm talking about, recognizing your purpose, like your why, that's what I'm talking about, right? So this great of something, excuse me, the sense of something greater. And, there's some of the best people I've known in my life, highly religious. Some of the
Hmm.
best people in my life, highly not religious, very
Yep.
spiritual. I say that's the crossover, right? And
Yeah.
have you heard of this? And I can't cite it because my wife just kind of threw it at me the other day. She's like, there's a study that shows that some of the most happy people in advanced age are highly spiritual. It's not
Hmm.
necessarily religious, right? And it made me
Hmm.
think about blue zones and sense of community
Absolutely.
and such.
Yeah.
Have you heard of that little anecdote?
So I have not heard of it, but I'm not surprised at all. Right? I mean, it definitely falls in alignment with other studies that I have been privy to, and I think it's just. I think that the more alignment you have spiritually, the more understanding that you have, and the more understanding you have, the more grace you give yourself and you give others, right? Which allows you to quell emotional turmoil a lot, right? And a deeper understanding of the importance of acceptance, right? And that is one of the biggest things, man, that I think that we struggle with is accepting what is, because we're always thinking about what could be or what could have been, right? And we get caught in that crossfire. And that's a dangerous place to be, man, because then we kind of take on this responsibility of control. And I think anyone, man, who's listening, like, there's only one thing you can control, right, in this entire journey, and that's yourself, right?
Yeah.
Everything else, you got to roll with the punches.
Yep, that's you, what you do in the circumstances, what thoughts you have, and also you
That's right.
can't control all your thoughts, right? You just talked about
That's
12
right.
to 60,000. Like we have
That's right.
these asinine, like hairball, like kind of scary and just super
Yes.
weird thoughts,
100%.
dreams, right? Like, so what do you think about your thoughts? Like,
Yeah.
that's what we can control. How do we navigate it?
Exactly.
Uh, and there's so many intersections of things I think are so impactful, right? We talk about identity, we talk about alignment, and
Hmm.
maybe work me is not aligned with home me. But
Hmm.
my wife makes fun of me because she's like, as soon as you pick up the phone, I don't have to see what phone it is. I know whether you're talking to someone at work, I know whether you're talking to a buddy at
Yeah.
home, I know whether you're talking to a peer or a
Yeah.
boss at work or one of your subordinates. I know all these things by your tone, what words you say. And
Yeah.
I'm like, man, is that like some crazy level of like code switching? But I also think that like I give myself grace, when I was thrown at me at a different direction of like, hey man, you got to be you. I'm like,
Mm.
but my relationships with all these people are extremely different,
Right.
and so yes, I don't want to be a different person, but I'm okay with the fact that my wife can tell by my inflection how excited I am. All these things, the words I use, I just have a different relationship. Whether I say sir, yes,
Mhm.
or whether I say hey, dude, or
Yeah.
how I say it.
Yeah. I think there's a lot to be said too, man, about understanding that different relationships call for different structures, right? There's different interplay, right? There's different expectations, right? And so not necessarily that you're having a conflict from within with your own identity, right? It's just a different rule set depending on what field you're stepping onto, right? And your role in that moment in time, right? So like, it's one thing if you start to, again, going back to values, you start sacrificing your values, right, as a human being, right, in those conversations. It's another thing if your listening and articulation skills shift a bit based on the understanding that exists between you and that person and the playing field that you're in, right? So like,
Right.
um for the viewers out there, right, there's a great tool that's out there. It's called the Johari window, right? And this came out in the late 50s, right? It's been a tool that's been used by Western psychologists for a long time, and it's pretty decent. It really is. But it talks about four different domains, right, of how it is we interplay with one another, right? And a big part of it, right, is the arena, right? The arena basically is all right, Eric, I know you. All right, you know me. And in this realm at this time, this is the rule set, right? So this is the game that we're playing, right? So like when you're talking to your subordinates or you're talking to your boss, right? There's an understood culture, microculture that's shared and how you talk
Yeah.
to one another, interact, right? And then we have the facade, right? The facade is everything where it's like, yeah, but maybe there's some BS in there, right? And then there's a bit of that element that kind of pops its head in, right? And then we have the most important one, in my opinion, right? Is it's the blind spot, right? It's the parts of that relationship, right? That perhaps they see in you, but you don't see in them, right? And that also goes part and parcel, right, with gaps in our own self mastery, gaps in our misalignment, right, and being able to understand and unpack, right, kind of what that means and how does that play out. So I would definitely encourage, man. Like there's a few different exercises you can do with that particular tool, but it's worth a Google search for sure.
Yeah, I wrote it down, man. So what were those 4 aspects again?
Yeah, man. So you've got the facade, you've got the arena, you've got the blind spot, and I want to say, and I hardly ever use the fourth one. I've got it actually right here in my files. The unknown, right? So the void,
Mm,
basically,
yeah.
right? And so they don't know, you don't know, right? And it's hard to explain. It's hard to explain.
Yeah, I love it, man. Like I'm scratching my head, I'm making notes. I mean, I talk about our blind spots and how we can recognize that by hitting up the people around us, right? Back to that accountability. Like
Yep.
we only see what we want. It's self-preservation. It's that protective mechanism going back to that earlier part of the conversation. But I'll share I'll share a vague anecdote where at work, because I think that people will understand kind of what I'm saying or how to apply this. But dealing with a boss, that's not the right words. Interacting with a boss,
Yeah.
and he told me to do something, and
Yeah.
I thought it was very much like when he circled back, he had all this follow up, like, what about this, this, and this? I was like, I thought it was just kind of like, yeah, just do it. Like, you know, kick the floor, like get it done, check the box. And he
Right.
just looks at me blankly. Like, I think like if I had to verbalize what he was thinking, it was just like, where did you get that idea? And,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
it was like, I could cut back. I could explain why I got the ideas because there were some other things like the tone, how it was addressed, no
Yeah.
specifics in that framework in my organizational culture. When you just want something done, you just say done, right? Hey, just do this. You give no parameters. So I'm like,
Sure.
okay, cool. He just wants, yeah, no. He's like, we care about this, right? I'm like, yeah, of course we do. I got it done. But what he was looking for was like next level. He wanted me to put my Eric brain on it and attack it from all these angles. I just got no sense of that. So,
Yeah.
sometimes what isn't said, isn't understood.
100%. Right. And I mean, that is, it's always interesting, man, because the art and science of communication, right? So, like, when you really break down the concept of communication, the point and purpose of communication is to what? It's to commune, right? Well, what's commune? It's to share, right? Well, what's the quality and depth of what you're sharing? Because if you're basing it off of assumption, like, yeah, I said it, and then we run with the assumption, right?
Hmm.
Like, man, that opens up the doors to a lot of ambiguity,
Yeah, and
right? Right?
I was looking at his body language. I was looking at his tone. I could remember the moment when I was assigned that thing, and I
Yeah.
was like, "Oh, this assignment is just a checkbox. Like, just get
Hmm.
it done and deal with
Yeah.
all the other stuff you're doing."
Yeah.
Yeah, and so you talk about communing, and so of course it's so difficult to reach people the right way. You can't do it with a broad stroke, but in
Hmm.
organizations we do it through email, and then we do it in a room, like roll
Yeah.
call, like just like the
Sure.
movies, right? Like Sarge
Yeah.
stands up there, talks to 6 to 9 people. There might be visitors just trying to commune, trying to see what's going on and
Yep.
offer some insight. They might be from a different unit, and then all those people are receiving the same words in 6 to 9, 12, 15 different ways.
That's right.
Everyone that reads that email, it's the same words, but based on your prior experience, based on your own mood when you're reading it. And so it's such a challenging thing to reach people where they're at. I mean, I'm curious what you have to say. My tactic is you got to try to meet them from different angles, but that is very time consuming. Like that's impractical in a lot of ways.
Yeah. So it is a very, very tough thing, right? And it's also extremely hard not to assume, not to go through the role of assumption, right? Because again, the brain's number one function, right, is to stay away from ambiguity. So you're trying to make sense of it, everything as fast as you possibly can. Matter of fact, we have this thing, the reticular activating system, right, that within our own mind, right? Like, it's like, for example, if I tell you, all right, Eric, from this point forward, right, like you're going to see a ton of red cars today, right?
Hmm.
Guarantee you, right? Like,
Yeah, yeah.
once you get off, just because I planted that
Dude,
one
it's
little
it's
seed,
a real thing when you're
it's a
looking. The
real thing.
suspect vehicle is like an early 2000s Altima. That's
Yeah.
all you can see. You're like,
Right.
I did not know that they made this many Altimas, and they're all in this town. The
100% right.
thing.
But the same goes with like what it is we're feeling that day, what we experienced that morning or that night. Like if I'm hooked on something, I'm fixated or something, or I'm upset about something or happy about something, like there's certain things, there's certain mental model triggers that get fired off, right? And so if the focus is that, the number one thing that I always tell folks is don't assume at all. Like try to suspend assumption, right? Ask more questions than being impressive to get to the end of the answer. Because a lot of us want to
Mm,
like try to finish that sentence. I know what you're going to say. I got you. Right. don't, right? Because
Dude,
at the moment you do that, right, it's that hard left, that hard right. And I didn't know, right? I'm going off of what the vibe was. And a lot of times, right, our vibe can be wrong depending on what it is that we experience that day, that week, that month, right? And that's not a good thing because a lot of people take pride in being able to size other people up or read people or, whatever the case is, right? And look, I'm not talking about the physical cues if someone's getting ready to punch you, right? I'm talking about just communication in general, right? Amongst colleagues, amongst family members, friends. Slow the pace down a little bit, right? Slow down the synaptic fire in your brain. Take a deep breath and really try to understand what they're saying and continue to unpack it with them, right? So you can really understand where they're coming from.
there's so much crossover to everything we were talking about earlier, right? Talk about policing and
Mm-hmm.
hearts and minds. The
Mm-hmm.
the best interviewers don't try to finish,
Yep.
don't, try to finish the sentence,
Yeah.
jump to conclusions, Matt, right?
Yes.
From Office Space. So like it's that whole just ask what happened, right? Like a lot
Yep.
of new, rookie cops are like, hey, I don't really know all the elements of the crime, and I'm trying to think of what else to ask and what to think about. Okay, cool. You're thinking about it means you're not listening. So just ask really open-ended questions.
Yes.
What happened here? Oh, I'm
Mm-hmm.
sorry. Like, can you clarify today? Like, what
There you
happened
go.
today?
Yes.
Right? And then you just let them talk. And then when
Yes.
something doesn't make sense and you want a clarification, like, can you tell me more? Right? Like, what?
Mm-hmm.
Tell me more about that part.
Mm-hmm.
How? Why? What do you think? Why? Where we get in our own way all the time, being efficient, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
I've been to hundreds of dispute calls or domestic
Mm-hmm.
calls, and this is the pattern. And oh, okay, yeah, I know what
Exactly.
they're gonna say. And man, the minute you interrupt and you're wrong, like the whole call is going downhill pretty quick.
Oh yeah. Oh
Your
yeah.
interview, everything. So there's like a tangible example there. And same for every other dynamic, right? I mean,
Yeah.
we can all see how ugly this goes when you play this off at home.
Oh.
Um,
Big time.
Yeah, this leadership class I went through relatively recently, the simple terms are try to be interested versus
Mm-hmm.
interesting, right? So be a Ted, not a
Nice.
Ting. And you
I
think
love
about
that.
that really, if that's catchy for you, try to
Yeah.
apply that to home, to work, all that.
Yeah, that's really good. I like that a lot. I like that a lot.
Sweet, man. Well, I want to be mindful of time and I also want to be mindful of the fact that we could keep going and my brain will just continue to melt. Um, but I mean, you're an absolute expert in relationships and brain optimization. Maybe for each of these really huge topics that we've already gone like down all these different rabbit holes, what are some tangible like kind of things, for I think if any listeners are like me where you're like, man, I got to listen to this back and take notes of what I want to Google later and
Yeah.
look at, Dr. G's work. What are some like maybe a couple tips to help cops and first responders that have to toggle all these challenges optimize their brain?
Yeah. Yeah. So I think, first and foremost, man, like unpack the notion of we've talked about there, but like self mastery, right? Like, so like start there and just start doing some digging on, because there's a lot of resources, right? On this concept, right? Um, as a matter of fact, there's a great book by a gentleman named Peter Sanjay. It's called The Fifth Discipline, right? I would highly recommend, right? Everyone take a read. Um, and it has a lot to do with systems thinking, right? And then at the same token, understanding that from a visualization component, how it is that you process information, right? And what it is, depending on the different filters that you have that are influenced by our emotions, right? And previously lived experiences. How do you make sense of your life? How do you make sense of the world, right? Because when we start having the brain optimization conversation, the very first place to start an optimization is to recognize exactly where we are at in our own inner frontier, right? So all of us have an inner frontier. We've got a wilderness in there, man, right? That we have to just dive all in, right? And it's scary and it's not fun because we have to come to this realization of, wow, there's a lot of parts of me that I don't understand because I do things and they feel right, and they feel right because I've always done them, because my mind has made them efficient over time, because that's just how we do things, right? That ain't good enough. We
Mm,
need to go a bit deeper, right? And I'm not talking about like taking a hardcore clinical psychology dive on this, right? And you can, right? But more importantly, take a somatic dive, right? To your within yourself. Like, what are the things, right, within yourself? If you were to write a T chart, things that you love, things that you don't, right? And just do a history line. Where's it come from? Right. Let me understand where that comes from. Right. What's the root of that? Right. So I think it's a really good place for folks to start on the brain optimization side, right? Because you have to understand what's clutter, right? And if it is clutter, how did it become clutter, right?
mm.
Because it feels functional, but is it actually? right? And what the thing that will always be your beacon of light, right, is your constitution, right? Does this fall in alignment with what that thing says? And does that thing reflect what's on that obituary, right? So
Yeah.
it's a triangulation, right? So again, it's always accountability, but it's self accountability. And people talk about that all the time, right? But it's very hard to actually pull it off. That is a tool and an exercise that allows you to do it.
Yeah, I love that. And it's like some people may think it sounds extreme, but that might be some of the potential benefit of a challenging exercise, right? Like, does this
Yes,
serve me or does it hinder me? And what is
exactly.
me? Like, it's me, my goals, my prerogatives, my mission in life, and who I am. Like, who makes me me and my living my best self, my most healthy version of myself. Uh, some things that come to mind in that are, I feel like in this, you kind of nodded at it, like the world's more complicated than ever, right? We have all these
Mhm.
inputs. We gotta mine them. We gotta see like what's affecting us, what's coming into our circle and negatively draining us. And so rather than add more like good things, like what noise can we prune away? Right? This notion of like let's remove some bad stuff because it's hard to add more, like more. Like we're already inundated with all these different stimuli. So what can we remove and to better serve all that?
Mm-hmm. 100%. I mean, and I think a really important thing, I mean, look, we live in a time of social media and smartphones and all that stuff, right? So to your point, right, the volume of stimuli is we're just not designed for it, man. And truth be told, our brain's not designed to multitask either. Like we're not
Mm,
good at it. Like a
yeah.
lot of people like to take pride. Like no, like you're juggling lots of things, right? But you're not actually doing any of them with excellence, right? And
Yep.
so if part of who you are as a person, right, is to strive for excellence, which I have a hard time believing any high performing, high achieving person doesn't have that at the tip of their spear. Does that serve you, right? If you take pride in it, right? Well, what are you actually doing, right? Because it may seem like you're doing something and you're just running on a treadmill. You're not actually going anywhere, right?
Yeah.
And so things like that to revisit on a constant basis. And, on the relationship side, and that's always a question of starting with communication, right? And so, like, the thing about communication, and we touched on this, was communication to commune, but we commune, and it always should be as a means of building community, right? So whether that's community at work, community at home, right? It's this idea of, and it's tribalism, right? Who do we interact with, right? What's the quality and depth of communication? What's the quality and depth of trust? And then what's the quality and depth that they add to my life and my existence? Because to your point, the exercises, they do feel extreme, right? And they're supposed to be, because the reality is we could sit here all day and have a plan for our life, also very well knowing for everyone who's listening and who's a first responder how quickly it could all just turn off, right? And
Hmm.
so that is the reality, right? Is it extreme? 100%. Do we like to think about it? No, right? But that is, I mean, we're flesh, right? So yeah, from the time we're born, our exit's already starting.
Yeah. Man, there's a lot there. And where my head goes is, it goes back to our earlier conversation about neural agility, right? So, like, again, that multitasking and the police work, the beginning of it, where you're learning all the radio, your computer, you're driving, and hey, there's policies that say don't use that computer while you're driving, which is
Yeah,
is laughable, right?
yeah,
So all these things, like you have to, they're competing for your
that's right.
attention.
That's right.
Um, yeah, and there's a crossover to just the admin type jobs, like corporate, right? Like when I was in a very administrative role, like I told myself, hey, I'm only gonna do bookkeeping, like receipt type stuff 1 day a week. Like it's
Yeah,
only gonna be Thursdays.
yeah,
But man, the bookkeeper, if they ever hear this, they're gonna lose their minds because it'd be like 18 emails needs to happen right now. It had need to happen yesterday. I'm like, 1 week, one time a week seems reasonable to me. But then it slips, and then you get
yeah.
pulled, and then you're dropping what you're doing for this thing. To your point, like, are you even doing any of it well? You're just giving the illusion of juggling.
That's right. That's exactly right. And that's, man, that is the thing where, like, within our brain, right, the prefrontal cortex, right, which is responsible for all of our executive function, right, which also includes our imagination, right? Like, it's tricky, man. And truly, there's so much we don't know about it. We don't understand about it within the scientific community, right? Like, there's way more we don't know than we do know, right? But what we do know is that the influence that this thing that it has, right? It is exceedingly powerful, right? And so for us to be able to garner the discipline, right? To be able to know what can we physically do, right, to slow down the operational tempo of our brain. There's very real things, right? The meditation, the breathing, the exercising, all the stuff, right, to release the endorphins and get kind of back to a baseline to help get them in control, right? And that's why that side of it truly is so important.
Yeah. Dr. G, I love that. And I love how you broke it down even with those examples, because that's the huge tenets for me, right? Part of my personal constitution as I start drafting in my head, it
Yeah,
has to be these different angles that feed my health. It's my strong belief that everyone needs to take a piece of that, in whatever way you do. And
yeah.
shout out to you. I saw in your story today, you got an injury, but you're still out there crushing it, right? Like
Got to
doing a
get
lot of
after it,
upper
my
body,
man.
core. Yeah. So exactly like, Dr. G, he's doing what he's putting out. Um, Dr. G, thank you so much for the host of information. I'm completely serious. My brain is super melty. It just feels sludgy now. Um, you're way
Sorry, brother.
you're
That
way
wasn't
too
the goal, man.
you're way too smart. No, but this is of extremely high value. So please, if there's anything you'd leave the listeners with, please tell them where they can find you and your work.
Yeah. Yeah, right on, man. Well, again, I mean, Eric, thank you, right? I mean, for having me. It's always a privilege and an honor, man, to speak to guys and gals that are doing what you're doing and helping so many. As far as connecting with me, I mean, on Instagram, right? So it's Dr. _Gino. And I have a book. The book's called The 7 Layers of Successful Relationships. It's 7layers.com. You can check that out as well. And if anything, man, you could just Google Dr. Gino Collura, and you'll see plenty of things pop up from interviews and articles. They'll send links. There's links there to find me.
Awesome. I knew this was going to be good, and I appreciate your time, man.
No, my pleasure, brother. Thank you so very much, man. And yeah, anything that I can ever do for the show, I can do for you. I can do for any of the listeners. I'm an open book, man. So I'm at everyone's service who's dialing in.
Thank you for tuning into another episode of Blue Grit Radio. As always, support this community by subscribing, giving us a 5-star review, and following, liking, and sharing posts on Blue Grit Wellness on Instagram. You can reach me there or email me at bluegritwellness@gmail.com. Be well and stay gritty.